It started like any other day at the Krusty Krab, with the smell of sizzling Krabby patties wafting through the salty air, the cheerful sounds of SpongeBob's humming in the kitchen, and Squidward's bored sighs echoing from the register. But today, something sinister lurked beneath the surface. Today would be the beginning of Bikini Bottom's end, a day none of them would ever forget. Unknown to everyone, Mr. Krabs, ever the miser, had been cutting costs on Krabby Patty ingredients. In his desperate attempt to save money, he struck a shady deal with an unknown supplier, bringing in a mysterious new chemical preservative to make the patties last longer on the shelf. He had no idea the catastrophic chain of events that decision would trigger. It was lunchtime, and the Krusty Krab was packed with its usual crowd of eager customers. SpongeBob cheerfully flipped patties in the back, while Squidward rolled his eyes, uninterested as always in the monotonous rhythm of the day. But something was off. Something in the air was heavy. And Squidward felt a strange unease settling in his gut. Then it happened. A fish at one of the tables began to cough violently. The sound was harsh and wet, drawing the attention of everyone around. The coughing turned into choking, and before anyone could react, the fish collapsed onto the ground, vomiting up thick, black bile. Panic ensued. Other patrons screamed and backed away from the writhing figure, but it was too late. The infected fish's skin began to turn a sickly green, his eyes clouding over with a milky film. Then, with a guttural snarl, he lunged at another customer, biting into their flesh with savage ferocity. Chaos erupted in the Krusty Krab. Patrons screamed, scattering in every direction, but the infection spread fast, too fast. Other customers, who had eaten the contaminated patties, began to vomit and collapse, their bodies convulsing violently as the virus took hold. Within minutes, the restaurant was filled with the sickening sounds of flesh being torn apart, blood splattering against walls, and the snarls of the newly turned zombies. In the back, SpongeBob heard the commotion and rushed out, his cheerful expression melting into horror as he saw the carnage unfolding before him. "Mr. Krabs," he screamed, but the old crab was frozen in place, wide-eyed and trembling as he realized what he had done. One of the infected zombies, once a regular fish customer, locked eyes on SpongeBob and lunged at him. SpongeBob tried to defend himself, but the zombie fish bit deep into his arm. SpongeBob screamed in agony, blood pouring from the wound, as his bright yellow skin began to lose its vibrant hue. Squidward, witnessing the horrifying scene from behind the register, could barely comprehend what was happening. His heart pounded in his chest, and his eyes widened in terror, as SpongeBob, now writhing on the ground, began to convulse. Mr. Krabs, in a desperate attempt to escape, shoved past Squidward, but his greed had cost him everything. Another wave of infected customers flooded toward the exit, trapping Mr. Krabs. Squidward heard his boss's desperate screams for help, but it was too late. Mr. Krabs was pulled into the throng of zombies, his cries silenced in a sea of gnashing teeth and gore. Squidward, paralyzed with fear, watched in horror as SpongeBob's body convulsed violently, his eyes glazing over as the virus took hold. Squidward screamed, finally snapping out of his frozen state, and bolted for the back exit. He pushed through the door and ran, the sounds of SpongeBob's snarling transformation haunting him as he fled. 3 weeks had passed since the outbreak. Bikini Bottom was unrecognizable, a ghost town filled with the stench of death and decay. Buildings had collapsed, streets were littered with wreckage, and the once vibrant undersea city was now overrun with the infected. The virus had spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. No one had been prepared for it, and the few survivors were scattered and hiding in whatever corners of the city they could find. Squidward had barricaded himself inside his house with Patrick. The once joyful, simple starfish was a shadow of his former self, shaken by the loss of their friends and the destruction of their home. They had made the mistake of returning to the Krusty Krab in the early days, hoping to find food and answers, but all they found was carnage. Mr. Krabs was dead, torn apart by the infected, and SpongeBob was something else entirely now. The infection had taken hold of SpongeBob quickly, turning him into something far more monstrous than any other zombie. His ability to regenerate his spongy body made him almost invincible. Worse yet, his once innocent face had become a grotesque mask of hunger, and he now roamed the empty streets, stalking the last survivors with a relentless predatory hunger. But there was a flicker of hope. Rumors had spread of one person who remained unaffected, Sandy Cheeks. Her dome had kept her safe from the initial outbreak, and her scientific mind had kept her alive. She had been working on a cure, or so the whispers said. Squidward had no way of knowing if the rumors were true, but it was the only hope they had left. "We have to get to her," Squidward muttered one night, staring at the boarded-up window of his house. "If there's even a chance that she's alive, we have to try." Patrick, curled up in the corner, looked up at Squidward with tear-streaked eyes. Do you think she can save us?" "I don't know," Squidward replied, his voice bitter. "But staying here is a death sentence." The next morning, they gathered what little supplies they had and prepared to make the treacherous journey to Sandy's dome. Squidward strapped on whatever makeshift weapons they could find, an old spear and some rusty kitchen knives, while Patrick clutched a large, blunt object for defense. The two friends, bound together by desperation, stepped out into the desolate streets, hoping to avoid the hordes of infected. As they navigated the ruins of Bikini Bottom, they passed by old landmarks that were now nothing more than memories. Jellyfish fields, where they had once enjoyed carefree days of catching jellyfish, was now a feeding ground for the infected. Glimpses of the zombies shambling through the tall grass made Squidward's stomach turn. The once colorful and lively town had become a nightmare, and then they saw him SpongeBob, or at least what was left of him. He was crouched in the ruins of the Krusty Krab, feasting on the remains of an infected fish. His body, now grotesque and deformed, had become a living nightmare. His eyes, once full of joy, were hollow and filled with an insatiable hunger. Squidward and Patrick froze, watching in horror as their former friend devoured the corpse, his spongy body oozing with the remnants of infection. Squidward's breath caught in his throat. There was no saving SpongeBob. He was gone. After days of navigating the dangerous streets, Squidward and Patrick finally made it to Sandy's dome. It stood tall and unscathed, a beacon of hope in the midst of chaos. But as they approached, something felt off. The infected had avoided the area, but there was a strange stillness in the air. They knocked on the door, their hearts pounding. For a moment, there was no response, and then the door slowly creaked open. Sandy, haggard and exhausted, stood before them, her usual adventurous spirit dampened by weeks of isolation and loss. "Y'all made it," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't think anyone else was left." Squidward wasted no time. "The cure. Do you have it?" Sandy nodded. "I've been working on it non-stop. It's not perfect, but it might be our only shot." She led them inside, where her lab was filled with makeshift equipment and vials of chemicals. "The virus is complicated, but I think I've isolated the strain. The problem is, we need a host, one of the infected." Squidward's heart sank. He knew what she was asking. You mean we have to capture one of them? Not just anyone, Sandy replied. We need SpongeBob. Patrick gasped, but he's not SpongeBob anymore. Sandy looked at them, her face hardened. If we don't try, this whole place will be lost. We have one chance. If we can cure him, we can stop this. Squidward clenched his fists. He didn't want to face SpongeBob again, but this was their only hope. Squidward clenched his fists. He didn't want to face SpongeBob again, but this was their only hope. The three of them, Squidward, Patrick, and Sandy, geared up for the most dangerous mission of their lives. With Sandy's equipment packed and the cure formula secured in vials, they set out from the safety of the dome and ventured back into the heart of Bikini Bottom, back toward the Krusty Krab, their goal, capture SpongeBob. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant moans of the infected, and the occasional scuttle of debris being blown by the underwater currents. Squidward's mind raced as they crept closer to the Krusty Krab, his heart pounding with every step. His memories of SpongeBob, his annoying laugh, his relentless optimism played in his mind, contrasting sharply with the monster they were about to confront. We get him in the net, and I'll inject him with the cure, Sandy instructed, her voice barely more than a whisper. It's risky, but if it works, it'll spread through his system and reverse the infection. What if it doesn't work? Patrick asked, his voice trembling. Sandy didn't answer. The truth was too hard to say aloud. They all knew that if the cure failed, the SpongeBob would be beyond saving. Squidward gripped his spear tighter. If the cure didn't work, they'd have to kill him. As they reached the wreckage of the Krusty Krab, the broken sign dangling from a single chain, they crouched behind the ruins of a nearby building, peering around the corner. SpongeBob was still there, scavenging through the remains, his body twitching and jerking unnaturally. His once bright yellow skin had become sickly and gray, patches of it hanging loosely from his body, as though decaying from the inside out. Patrick gasped as they watched. That's not SpongeBob anymore. Sandy motioned for them to get into position. She held the net ready, her hands shaking slightly, but her determination rock solid. Squidward and Patrick flanked her, weapons drawn, ready to defend if things went wrong. On three, Sandy whispered. 1, 2, 3. With a swift, fluid motion, Sandy threw the net over SpongeBob, the metal cords wrapping around his deformed body. SpongeBob screeched, his voice a horrifying gurgle as he thrashed against the net. His eyes, once filled with warmth, were now wild, vacant, and ravenous. Now, Sandy shouted as she lunged forward with the syringe in hand. Squidward and Patrick held the net down with all their strength, but SpongeBob's strength was unnatural. He fought back with the ferocity of a wild animal, snarling and gnashing his spongy teeth. Sandy jabbed the syringe into SpongeBob's side, injecting the cure directly into his body. For a moment, everything went still. SpongeBob stopped thrashing, his body stiffening as the liquid coursed through his veins. Squidward held his breath, watching closely for any sign that the cure was working. But then, SpongeBob's body convulsed violently. His screams echoed through the empty streets, blood and foam bubbling from his mouth. The infection seemed to fight back against the cure, twisting and warping SpongeBob's body even further. His form expanded grotesquely, his limbs elongating unnaturally, as if the infection was desperately trying to maintain its hold. "Squidward, hold him down," Sandy yelled, as she grabbed another syringe, but it was too late. SpongeBob's monstrous form burst free from the net, sending Squidward and Patrick flying back into the rubble. Sandy scrambled back, her eyes wide with horror, as SpongeBob turned his bloodshot eyes on her. He lunged, faster and more deadly than before. Squidward, dazed but alive, grabbed his spear and threw himself in front of Sandy just as SpongeBob was about to strike. The two collided and Squidward managed to drive the spear into SpongeBob's side, stopping him in his tracks. But it wasn't enough. SpongeBob let out a guttural growl, ripping the spear out of his body as though it were nothing. Blood poured from the wound, but it didn't seem to slow him down. "Get up," Squidward shouted, pulling Sandy to her feet as they backed away. Patrick, shaken but still conscious, joined them, wielding his blunt weapon. The three friends were trapped, surrounded by the wreckage of their once beloved restaurant, with nowhere left to run. Suddenly, SpongeBob let out another scream, this time a high-pitched, agonized wail. His body convulsed violently again, but this time, the infection seemed to be losing. The cure was working. SpongeBob collapsed to the ground, his body twitching as the infection finally began to recede. The grotesque bulges and deformities smoothed out, his skin slowly returning to its original yellow. His wild, feral eyes blinked, slowly regaining their clarity. For a moment, there was only silence. "SpongeBob," Patrick whispered, stepping forward cautiously. SpongeBob looked up at them, his eyes filled with tears and confusion. "Patrick," SpongeBob croaked, his voice weak but unmistakably his. What happened? Where am I?" Squidward felt a lump form in his throat. He never thought he'd be so relieved to hear SpongeBob's voice again. "You were gone," he managed, his voice hoarse. "But we got you back." Sandy rushed forward, kneeling beside SpongeBob, checking his pulse and looking him over. "The cure worked," she said, her voice shaking with relief. "He's back." SpongeBob, still confused and weak, looked around at the destruction, at the Krusty Krab in ruins and at his friends, each of them battered, bloodied, but alive. "What about Mr. Krabs?" SpongeBob asked. Squidward looked away, the weight of the truth too heavy to bear in that moment. "He didn't make it." Tears welled up in SpongeBob's eyes, but he nodded. He already knew the answer deep down. The cost of saving Bikini Bottom had been unimaginable. Weeks later, Bikini Bottom was still in ruins, but there were signs of recovery. Sandy's cure had been administered to the remaining infected, and slowly but surely, the survivors began to rebuild what had been lost. The infection, though devastating, had been stopped, and life in Bikini Bottom, while forever changed, began to return to some semblance of normalcy. Squidward, now forever haunted by the memories of that horrific day, sat on the ruins of his home, looking out over the quiet streets. SpongeBob and Patrick, both bruised but alive, worked together to rebuild the Krusty Krab, their bond stronger than ever. But Squidward couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently. The horrors they had endured had left a mark on all of them, a reminder that even in the happiest of places, darkness could take root. As the sun began to set over Bikini Bottom, Squidward closed his eyes and sighed. They had survived, but they would never forget.